49,000 cases a day by mid-October. The UK's chief medical officer believes that is what will happen if measures aren't taken to stem the surge of coronavirus infections. Chris Whitty says the rates are roughly doubling every 7 days, and he's calling for immediate action. A recent rise in the number of cases has pushed infection rates to levels last seen in May, and health officials say the number of fatalities is also likely to go up in coming weeks. Tighter restrictions have been imposed on communities in northeastern England, and later this week the government is expected to announce a series of short-term measures to act as a so-called circuit breaker to slow the spread of the disease. Whitty said that the country had, quote, in a bad sense, literally turned a corner, and warned that the UK was treading a fine line in its handling of the virus.
If we do too little, this virus will go out of control and we will get significant numbers of increased direct and indirect deaths. But if we go too far the other way, then we can cause damage to the economy, which can feed through to unemployment, to poverty, to deprivation, all of which have long-term health effects. So we need always to keep these two sides in mind.
Well, for more on this story, let's go over to London now, where we can speak to our correspondent, Ty Genwright. Ty, we just heard there from the UK's chief medical officer. How concerned is the government that its message isn't getting across?
I think the government is always concerned that people aren't necessarily following the rules, but I think what we're seeing today is the groundwork being laid for a tightening of these rules. And it's not just, I think, people which their government is seeking to blame. I think there's an acknowledgement that the virus is spreading and resurging at a rate that perhaps people weren't quite prepared for. We've been hearing that cases have been doubling every day, and of course, unless something is done to arrest that increase, well, then there is the danger that it gets out of control. Now, only last week, this day last week, in fact, the government introduced a new set of messaging telling people to restrict their social gatherings to parties of a maximum of 6, whether that be outdoors or indeed indoors. That was an effort to simplify the message from what had become a kind of a patchwork of different measures across the country. But in the time since then, things seem to have snowballed to a degree, where you've got new, tighter restrictions being put into place in the northeast of the country and in parts of Wales too. New restrictions which effectively ban socialising with people who don't already live with you, who aren't part of your household, and putting time limits or early closing times on bars and on restaurants. And the feeling is that that's going to spread to other population centres too. One of the warnings that we heard over the weekend was that London, the biggest population centre in the country, is perhaps only 2 weeks behind those parts of the country which are having an increase in cases. So what we're hearing about is this talk of what's known as a circuit breaker. What that means in layman's terms is a short, sharp shock, perhaps new tighter restrictions for a period of just 2 or 3 weeks to try to stop the spread, to try and stop cases from doubling every day so that things don't get out of control as winter approaches.
Ty, you mentioned that circuit breaker there, and presumably that's why the Prime Minister is hosting the Cobra meeting tomorrow at Downing Street. Do we know if they're also going to discuss the prospect of a further lockdown, perhaps even in London, where you are, as suggested by the Mayor a few days ago?
Yeah, I think that certainly will be up for discussion. Cobra is the government's emergency committee, and it gives, cabinet members and the Prime Minister a chance to talk to all interested parties. And we're told that there will indeed be additional conversations before that meeting with the First Ministers of Scotland, of Wales and Northern Ireland too. I think the very holding of this emergency meeting is something designed to send out a message not just to the public but also to politicians too, because we're hearing that members of Boris Johnson's own cabinet are concerned that more measures which will inflict pain on businesses can't be entertained, even if it is to protect people's lives. But I think there's been a very deliberate timing in all this. Ministers have been laying the groundwork for more restrictions all weekend. Today we heard the warning from the scientific and the medical advisors, and tomorrow we think we're going to hear from the Prime Minister about the political response. Tokes?
Ty again right there, our correspondent with the latest from the UK. Thank you.